Alright, we've talked about basic setup with a J-frame and a J-panel inside, dropping components in, responding to events. But something else that we want to do sometimes with our graphical applications is we want to do some painting. We want to draw lines or circles or rectangles, or maybe write some text in a window. For example, if we're making a game, we can only get so far with buttons and labels and checkboxes. We want to draw a character and update its position and show maybe a grid for a playing field and things like that. So we want to do some painting. And if we look at the JPanel documentation, there's a method it inherits from component called paint. And if we look at the paint method, it takes an argument, which is a graphics object, and that graphics class is very interesting. It contains a number of methods such as draw characters, draw a 3D rectangle, draw an arc, draw a line, draw an oval, draw a polygon, draw a rectangle. There's also fill versions which will draw those shapes but filled in. And this is what we want to play with to do some painting on our JPanel. So let's start a new project, and I'll just call this class 12. And as before, we're going to say new. I'm going to come down to other, and I'm going to make a new J-frame, and I'll just call it main. And so if we look at the design window, we know that we've got a J-frame sitting out here, and if we run this code, there's just an empty J-frame, nothing much else going on. So inside this code, there's this thing, it's called a content pane, and it's a JPanel. What we're going to do is make our own version of a JPanel so that we can make our own paint method. So right now, the paint method for a JPanel, basically draws the panel. It fills it in with a background color and not a whole lot else. But if we add components like buttons and labels, it will do the drawing, lighten or darken the pixels to make those objects appear and so on. So we're going to make our own version of a JPanel. So I'm going to say File, New Class, and I'm going to call this class MyPanel. And then inside here I'm going to say extends JPanel. Now when we're done writing a statement, if we're getting a message saying there's an error, there's a red line underneath and a marker in the border, we can hover over that underlined word and see what some of the issues are and some of the possible fixes. And one possible fix is to import JPanel. Well, that's the right thing, right? JPanel is a class that comes from Swing, and we need to import it. So I can just come down here and left click on this quick fix, and bingo, there's an import statement. All right, so we've got a JPanel that we're calling MyPanel, and what I'm going to do over here is where I have a JPanel, I'm going to change this to a MyPanel. Alright, so content pane is going to be a MyPanel, and down here I'm going to construct a new MyPanel. And when I run this, it looks the same, right? There's really no obvious difference here. But since this is our own class, we can make our own methods inside this class, and we can override methods from the base class, the JPanel class. So let's override the paint method. So I'm going to say public void paint. Takes a graphics object, we'll still call it G. And let's say G.fillOval. And we'll put an oval at 50-50 and we'll make it 100 by 100. And that's all we're going to do. So graphics has to be uppercase, but it's still going to be complaining because graphics hasn't been imported. It's part of the abstract windowing toolkit, java.awt. We can click this, it makes an import statement for us. We're all set to go now. So if we run our code, now we've got a window with an oval on it. And if instead of 100, I make this 400 by 600, when I run that, I'll get a 400 by 600 oval. So we can draw, right? All right, so let's make this a little more complicated. Let's come back to our main window. All right, so let's do the following. Let's take a J button and drop that into our window. So there's a new button. And if we run this, there's our window. It's got our oval. It's got our button. We can click the button. It doesn't do anything yet. But when I resize the window, that button disappears. And that's kind of weird, right? So why is our button disappearing? Well, it turns out that when we make our own version of a JPanel and we write our own paint method, we are taking over the entire paint method, right? So the paint method normally is, let's just hover over this and read, right? This method delegates the work of painting. This is supposed to not only do the painting that we're going to specify to like fill an oval and so on, but it also does things like fill in the background color and draw components. So if we've got a button on the screen, it's the paint method in the JPanel class that draws that button. Well, the paint method in my panel doesn't draw a button. All it does is fill in an oval. And so that button may or may not appear. Or it might appear for a while and then disappear when you resize the window, for example. So we really need to do everything that the original JPanel paint method was doing, and then we want to go ahead and do our own painting. Well, we're not going to replicate all the code inside the original paint method. We're just going to call the paint method from the original class. So when we extend a class, we can use the keyword super to say, hey, I'm going to call a method. I want to run the method from the class that we extended. So I'm going to say super.paint, and I'm going to pass that same graphics object G to it. Now, if I didn't say super, if I just said paint, this would be paint calling itself. We'd blow up our stack, right? But I'm not calling this paint method. I'm calling the paint method from JPanel. And that's the method that's responsible for, among other things, drawing buttons. So when I run this, now when I resize my window, my button still appears. And I didn't put down an absolute layout manager, right? I left it with the default one, which means that it's centering my button in this window. So that's why the button is moving around. All right, so so we can override the paint method, we can do our own things, but we can also use the class that we're extending, the JPanel, use the paint method from that. So a few other things we can do. Let's go back in our My Panel, and before we fill the rectangle, before we fill the oval, let's make a red oval. Let's set the color to red. Well, we can say g.setColor, and we can say color.red. And we need to import the color class. And this is just G. All right, so what is this color class? Color is just another class. It's part of the abstract windowing toolkit. It has a number of fields, including, you know, red or lowercase red, pink, lowercase pink, and so on. Those are statics, so we can say the name of the class, color dot the name of the field. And so we can say set the color of this graphics object to be red, and then let's fill in an oval. And if we do that, we get a red oval. All right, so the last thing I want to do here is set things up so that the size of this oval is changeable. And let's set it so that when we click this button, the oval gets bigger. All right, so well, I already double clicked the button, which takes me down to a chunk of code that was just created. So when this is where we are when the button is clicked. So I'm going to keep track of the radius, and I'm going to say, let's say radius gets increased by 10, if radius is greater than 300, let's reset it to 10. And radius is just going to be an integer, which we'll start off at, 100. All right, so every time we click the button, the radius is going to increase by 10. And when it gets to 300, it'll roll back over to 10. And so how are we going to make this radius the radius of the oval that we draw? Right? Because we're setting the radius in here, but the drawing happens in this entirely different class, in this method called paint in the MyPanel class. And we can't call the paint method from here. Number one, because we don't have a graphics object, but number two, we're not supposed to call the paint method, right? The paint method gets called by the Java system, the window manager, a number of other things. If every time something wanted to paint on the display, it could just go in and start changing pixels, it would be chaos, right? So painting is done in a very controlled way. What we can do is we can say, hey, when you're ready to paint this panel, here's what I want you to do. But we can't say, okay, right now let's go ahead and draw an oval, because there may be other things going on. So the best we can do is we can call a method repaint. So the content pane, which is our MyPanel, content pane, and we can call a repaint method. And this says, ask the system to call paint when it can. All right, so this is getting closer now, but the one piece that's missing is, we're updating the value of radius in here, but we're drawing our oval inside here. So what we'd like to do is this. We'd like to have a variable, I'm just going to call it radius, and then down here I'm going to use radius for the size of the oval. So we'll start at 50-50 and we'll draw with that X and Y radius. We can initialize this. But we've got to change this, right? When we click the button, we're changing the value of radius here. We really want to change the value of radius here. So let's do this the right way. Let's make a mutator. So let's say public void set radius. And I'm going to use the this trick, this dot radius equals radius. So now I can call the set radius method, give it a number, and it will change the value of this variable. And then when the paint method gets called, that variable's value will be used to set the radius of the circle. So now in here, all I have to do is, before I call repaint, I can say content pane dot set radius. And this will set the radius field inside the MyPanel, the content pane. And then when I call repaint, it should be painted with that radius. So if I run this, there's our 100 by 100 circle, and each time that I click this, it gets bigger. And it'll grow up to 300, and then it shrinks back down to 10. That's basically all we need to be able to do, right? If we can do that, we can start wiring things any way that we want. So for example, let's add another button to our window. So I'll add a J button. And this button over here, this first button, let's call that grow. And this new button, let's call that reset. And let's write some code for the reset button. Well, the only thing the reset button is going to do is set the radius equal to 10, and then content pane dot set radius. Actually, I'll set it to 100. Alright, and I'm deliberately making one mistake in here. So let's go ahead and run this. So I can grow, and I can click reset, but it doesn't look like it worked. Alright, reset should change the size back to 100, but my circle is still big. Now if I hit the grow button again, suddenly it jumps back down. So let's make our circle large again. Let's hit the reset button. Nothing seems to be happening, but watch what happens if I resize my window. The circle goes back to the true size, 100 by 100. So what's going on here? It's very simple, but it's a really easy thing to overlook. I've changed the radius to 100. I've reset the radius inside my panel, but that does not cause it to draw the circle. The circle only gets drawn when the paint method is called. Now, if I resize the window, the system will call the paint method because, hey, you know, maybe part of this has changed, being visible or not visible. Maybe part of it was obscured and I made the window bigger, and now I should redraw everything so I can see it all. So resizing the window will call the paint method, but if I don't do something, the paint method doesn't get called. So how do I force it to call the paint method? I say content pane.repaint. And that forces a call to paint when the system is able to. So now if I run this, I can make my circle bigger, and if I hit reset, it immediately goes back to its original size.